In the bitter cold January freeze of 1795, President Washington sat in a contemplative state in the Executive Mansion in Philadelphia. 1794 was an eventful and challenging year. The Whiskey Rebellion raged in the western counties of Pennsylvania, and after years of struggle, the tribes involved in the Western Confederacy under the leadership of Chief Little Turtle were finally defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, helping to secure a portion of the Northwest Territory at long last.
But following the cessation of the Whiskey insurrection and the potential opening of the Northwest Territories, Washington's mind quickly turned to the new dilemma that was threatening to bring the growth of the new nation to a grinding halt. As our nation grew westward, how would we be able to properly connect the growing West with the established cities in the East? How could our military be able to move from point to point when the need arose?
The Appalachian Mountain Range was a natural barrier between East and West. The lack of good roads crossing the mountains was a major factor in bringing on the Whiskey Rebellion. And getting an army into the Northwest Territories was no small task. The growing nation needed a way to conquer this space, and President Washington was quick to realize this need. "It is," said Washington, "to open a wide door and make a smooth way for the produce of that country to pass to our markets before the trade may get to another channel."
Washington, he said that if we didn't connect those two, that the Western country would be as if sitting on a pivot, and nothing but the touch of a feather might change its loyalties from us to France or from us to Spain. And by putting roads in from the east, we were going to start to secure that land as part of our new United States of America.
Alexander Hamilton, Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, produced his Report on Manufacturers, which was critical in persuading the President to promote the federal government's role in public investment. Both men, having a broad interpretation of the Constitution, believed that the General Welfare Clause supported this ideology. However, Thomas Jefferson, Washington's Secretary of State and a political foe of Hamilton, had a much different view of the role of the federal government. Ironically, these conflicting political ideologies would come into play during Jefferson's presidency as the nation continued to grow and a greater need for internal improvements would press him to make a most difficult decision concerning the future of the nation.
After his victory in the election of 1800, Jefferson could not possibly have realized the monumental changes he would help to produce in his first term in the White House. The acquisition of the Louisiana Territory proved to be not only the most enduring legacy of the Jefferson presidency, but also one that would cause much consternation as to the role of the federal government in encouraging westward development and connecting the growing West with the established East. By 1806, following the Louisiana Purchase and the success of the Lewis and Clark expedition, the symbiotic leadership of President Thomas Jefferson and his Secretary of Treasury, Albert Gallatin, would finally help bridge the East with the West with the creation of America's first federally funded highway, the National Road.
And he tasks Gallatin with not only coming up with the money for the construction of the road, but also to choose the route the road is going to take.
However, prior to signing the bill that would appropriate funds for the road, President Jefferson battled with personal demons concerning his strict interpretation of the Constitution. Jefferson knew full well that the road was now a necessity, but he also feared that the power of the federal government may impede that of the states. Jefferson ultimately wanted an amendment to validate the building of the road, but his desire to interconnect the nation proved a more pressing issue than his constitutional analysis.
His decision to sign the bill appropriating the funds for the National Road would have far-reaching consequences that still reverberate throughout our society well into the 21st century.
National Road, the decision to do it provides a precedent for, later on, as we said, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, more importantly, Federal Aid to Education, Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, Student Financial Aid, Higher Education Act of 1965.
Gallatin's contributions to the passage of this legislation were enormous. His career in public service to this point had been a remarkable one.
Gallatin helped drive the bill through Congress when he tied the sale of federal lands in the individual states through which the road would pass to be exempt from state taxation for 10 years. In exchange for this provision, certain sections that were sold by the United States would be reserved for education. Also, Gallatin ensured that a portion of the net proceeds of the land sold would be applied to laying out the road itself to connect navigable rivers with the road to create a nexus from the Atlantic Ocean into the Ohio Territory. In effect, this was not only a plan for internal improvements, but in fact a complete national plan.
To further solidify the need for not only the national road, but also a complete interconnected system of transportation to connect the East and West, Gallatin submitted to the Senate the report of the Secretary of the Treasury on Roads and Canals. This comprehensive report, along with Hamilton's report on manufacturers, provide the cornerstone of the federal government's investment into public projects.
He once said in one of his messages, we should checker the nation with roads and canals.
By 1808, surveyors were mapping a route from Cumberland, Maryland to Wheeling, Virginia. Just 3 years later, after a very labor-intensive effort, the road, at last, conquered the Appalachians and interconnected the nation. The impact of the road was immediate.
The road was also personally gratifying to Gallatin, a resident and prominent businessman in southwestern Pennsylvania.
He really wanted to develop transportation for commerce, and the Jefferson administration was very interested in that too.
But Mr. Gallatin had political aspirations in Pennsylvania, and he had businesses here in Pennsylvania, and it would be beneficial to him and some of his constituents and colleagues to see the road come in this direction. And so he chose a path that brought the National Road from Cumberland, Maryland, up through Addison, which was Old Petersburg at the time, through the city of Uniontown, founded July 4th, 1776, into Brownsville and through Washington, and out through West Alexandria and heading towards Wheeling, West Virginia, where it met the banks of the Ohio.
Having that road pass as close to Friendship Hill as it did was a benefit to him because he had industries with goods to go to market.
From its inception in 1811 through the 1850s, the National Road was the main street of America.
It became a turning point because it was the first time the federal government would make an effort to improve commerce in a nation. So that's where it serves as an important part in the change of our history. Prior to that, roads were paid for either through public funds, or not public funds, private funds, or state monies. So this was unique in the fact it was federal monies.
Sadly, the 1850s would see the road's demise as steam power and the growth of railroads would replace the road as a more efficient way to transport goods and people.
However, with the coming of the automobile, the old pike would come back into prominence as portions of the National Road were now transformed into modern Route 40. Travelers along this highway have now rediscovered the charm of the National Road at places like the Century Inn in Scenery Hill, Pennsylvania.
Our job is to maintain and make this the inn better. And we're just passing through and we're just caretakers, but it's quite a responsibility to take good care of it because it is our history.
I would say the legacy, his decision is very rich, helped to unify the country. Unity.
But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the National Road involves its impact on the role of the federal government and American society. As a transportation corridor and the federal project that shaped and changed the political ideologies of some of the greatest statesmen in our nation's history, the National Road is, in fact, a national treasure with a legacy that has stood the test of time.